Did you know that a single colonial officer's reckless raid in 1754 set in motion a conflict that would engulf 3 continents and reshape the balance of power for a century? The story begins on the frontier of Virginia's western lands, where a young George Washington, barely 20, commanded a modest detachment of Virginia militia. In December of that year, Washington led his men to the French-built Fort Duquesne at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, a strategic point that would later become Pittsburgh. He demanded the French surrender. When they refused, he ordered an artillery barrage that destroyed the French palisade, igniting the first open clash of what would become the 7 Years' War. Washington's decision was not an isolated act of youthful bravado, it reflected a broader imperial rivalry between Britain and France over the Ohio Valley. The British Crown, through the Ohio Company, had granted massive tracts of land to speculators hoping to profit from westward settlement, while the French, operating through the Compagnie d'Indes, sought to link their Canadian holdings with the Mississippi Valley. By the early 1750s, both powers had dispatched soldiers, traders, and native allies to stake claims, and the region's Native American nations, most notably the Shawnee, Delaware, and Iroquois, found themselves courted and coerced into alliances that would determine the fate of the continent. In 1753, the French erected Fort Duquesne to block British expansion, prompting the Virginia governor, Robert Dinwiddie, to send a young officer, a 21-year-old Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, on a diplomatic mission to demand its surrender. Washington's journey across the Allegheny Mountains was arduous. He traveled with a small party, endured harsh winter conditions, and was turned back by French forces at the forks of the Ohio. Undeterred, he returned to Virginia with a stark report that the French were fortifying their position, a report that fueled Dinwiddie's determination to act before the French could consolidate their hold. Dinwiddie's response was swift and aggressive. He raised a company of Virginia militia, supplemented by regular British troops and a contingent of native allies, and appointed Washington as commander of the expedition. The force, numbering roughly 300 men, set out in the spring of 1754, intent on establishing a British presence at the strategic fork. When they arrived at the French encampment, Washington demanded the French withdraw, an ultimatum that the French commander, Jacques Lagarde de Saint-Pierre, rejected. The ensuing artillery exchange, though limited in scale, was the first recorded shot of the larger conflict that would later be termed the French and Indian War in the colonies and the 7 Years' War globally. The fallout from Washington's attack rippled through the British administration in London. Prime Minister Henry Pelham, already wary of French encroachments, saw an opportunity to assert British claims in North America. He authorized a substantial increase in colonial defenses, allocating over £100,000 for fortifications and troop deployments, a sum that, adjusted for inflation, would exceed £30 million today. This financial commitment signaled a shift from indirect colonial governance to direct imperial involvement, setting the stage for a global confrontation. Across the Atlantic, French officials interpreted the skirmish as a provocation that threatened their North American empire. This escalation forced the British to reconsider their defensive posture, prompting the Crown to call for a larger expeditionary force from Europe. In response, Britain commissioned General Edward Braddock, a seasoned commander from the War of the Austrian Succession, to lead a massive army of approximately 5,000 regulars and colonial militia to the Ohio frontier. Washington, still a lieutenant colonel, was appointed aide-de-camp to Braddock, a position that provided him unprecedented exposure to European military discipline and strategic planning. During the march through the Appalachian foothills, Washington observed the British reliance on linear tactics, the use of tight formations, and the logistical challenges of supplying an army in hostile terrain. He also witnessed the growing friction between regular officers and colonial militia, a tension that would later inform his own command style in the Revolutionary War. The decisive encounter between Braddock's forces and French Indian troops occurred on July 9, 1755, near the Monongahela River. French commander Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, aided by a coalition of Delaware, Shawnee, and Huron warriors, executed a classic ambush, exploiting the dense forest to conceal their approach. The British column, marching in a rigid column formation, was caught off guard. Within minutes, the French fire decimated the front ranks, and the British artillery, unable to be deployed effectively, fell silent. Braddock was mortally wounded, and his army suffered over 800 casualties, a loss that represented more than 15% of the expedition's strength. Washington's role in the battle was pivotal. He rallied retreating militia, organized a defensive perimeter, and personally led a small group of soldiers through the chaos to safety. His actions earned him the admiration of both colonial and British officers, and his reputation as a competent leader grew. Yet the defeat also exposed the limits of British conventional tactics in the North American wilderness, prompting a strategic reassessment that would influence subsequent campaigns across the globe. The defeat at Monongahela resonated far beyond the frontier. In Europe, the loss was interpreted as a signal that Britain could not rely solely on its professional army to secure distant colonies. Consequently, the British Parliament authorized a series of naval expeditions to disrupt French supply lines, commissioning Admiral Edward Hawke to command a fleet that would later capture the French port of Louisbourg in 1758. This naval victory cut off French reinforcements to Canada, shifting the strategic balance in favor of the British in the North American theater. Simultaneously, the French, emboldened by their success, intensified their campaigns in Europe. In 1756, Frederick the Great of Prussia, allied with Britain, declared war on Austria, drawing the French into a broader coalition against the Habsburgs. The conflict quickly expanded, encompassing battles in Silesia, the Rhineland, and the Indian Ocean, where French and British naval forces vied for supremacy. By 1759, the war had become truly global, with theaters in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India, each feeding resources and troops into a self-reinforcing cycle of escalation. Back in the colonies, the British response to the French threat evolved from conventional trench warfare to a more flexible, frontier-oriented approach. In 1758, General James Wolfe, fresh from the siege of Louisbourg, led a combined force of regulars, colonial militia, and native allies to capture Fort Duquesne. After a swift three-day campaign, the French abandoned the fort, burning it to the ground. The British erected a new stronghold, Fort Pitt, cementing their control over the strategic fork and providing a launch point for further incursions into the Ohio Valley. The capture of Fort Duquesne marked a turning point not only in the North American theater but also in Washington's career. He was promoted to colonel and given command of the Virginia Regiment, tasked with defending the frontier against renewed French and native resistance. Over the next 3 years, Washington led numerous expeditions, built forts, and negotiated with tribal leaders, gaining valuable experience in both warfare and diplomacy. His reputation as a resilient, adaptable commander grew, setting the stage for his eventual rise to general and later president of the United States. Meanwhile, the larger 7 Years' War continued to reshape empires. In Europe, the 1763 Treaty of Paris, signed after the decisive British victory at the Battle of Quiberon Bay and the capture of Montreal, redrew colonial boundaries. Britain emerged with nearly all French possessions in North America, acquiring Canada, Florida, and the Caribbean islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, while France retained only a few fishing rights off Newfoundland. The treaty also transferred Spanish territories, such as Louisiana, to French control, only to return them to Spain in exchange for the return of Havana, Cuba. These diplomatic maneuvers underscored how a skirmish in the Allegheny foothills had precipitated a massive reallocation of global assets. The financial burden of the war, however, left Britain heavily indebted. The Crown raised over £100 million through war taxes, a sum that strained relations with the American colonies. In the aftermath, the French, humiliated by their loss, embarked on a policy of military reform under the direction of the Marquis de Choiseul. They modernized their navy, restructured colonial administration, and sought to rebuild alliances with native peoples. However, the loss of Canada and the weakening of French influence in the interior forced them to rely increasingly on Caribbean sugar economies, reshaping their colonial focus toward plantation agriculture and the transatlantic slave trade. Washington's early involvement also had a personal impact on his worldview. The experience of fighting alongside native allies, seeing the devastation wrought upon indigenous villages, and confronting the limits of British authority contributed to his later ambivalence about imperial power. His later writings reveal a nuanced perspective on the cost of empire, a perspective forged in the crucible of a frontier war that had spiraled into a world conflict. The 7 Years' War, often called the First World War, demonstrated how colonial skirmishes could trigger a cascade of alliances, battles, and treaties that reshaped continents. The conflict involved over a dozen major powers, mobilized more than 1 million soldiers, and resulted in an estimated 400,000 deaths, both military and civilian. It accelerated the development of modern logistics, as armies learned to supply troops across oceans, and it spurred innovations in military engineering, such as the use of fortifications designed by Vauban's successors in the New World. Washington's raid at Fort Duquesne, though modest in scale, approximately 150 men against a French garrison of 60, was the spark that ignited this massive conflagration. The incident illustrates how individual agency, when intersecting with imperial ambitions, can have disproportionate consequences. It also underscores the interplay between local grievances and global strategies, a dynamic that continues to define international relations today. In the decades that followed, the legacy of the 7 Years' War lingered. The British Empire's expansion created new markets and resources that fueled the Industrial Revolution, while the fiscal pressures that followed contributed directly to the ideological ferment of the Enlightenment. The war's outcomes also set the stage for the later Napoleonic conflicts, as the reshaped map of Europe left rivalries unresolved and power blocks unstable. Reflecting on the chain of events, one sees how a young officer's decision to fire a cannon on a cold December night in 1754 set off a series of diplomatic, military, and economic reactions that rippled across oceans. The 7 Years' War, born of that moment, reshaped empires, redrew borders, and altered the trajectory of countless peoples. It stands as a testament to the profound impact that seemingly small actions can have when they intersect with the ambitions of great powers, a lesson that resonates as sharply today as it did in the smoky valleys of the Ohio frontier.